In this video, we will be discussing a very horrific mass murder that took place in 1912 in Villisca, Iowa. It is still talked about to this day, and you can even stay in the house in which it happened. I am talking about the Villisca Axe Murder House. So this story revolves around the Moore family and two house guests. The father, Josiah Moore, 43 at the time, was a well-respected businessman in Villisca. He had worked for a man named Frank Jones, who owned a Jones store in Iowa and was also a state senator, and later he went into business for himself. Josiah married his wife Sarah Montgomery on December 6, 1899, at his parents' home in Villisca. Sarah was a homemaker and an active member of the Presbyterian Church. Together they had 4 children: Herman Moore, who was 11, Catherine Moore, 10, Boyd Moore, 7, and Paul Moore, 5. On Sunday, June 9th, the day before the murders, Josiah and Sarah took their 4 children to a Children's Day service at their Presbyterian church. 2 of the neighbor girls who were friends with the Moore's children, Lena and Ina Stillinger, asked their parents if they could go with them and then spend the night at their house afterward. Being friends and not thinking anything of it, the parents agreed to let them go with the Moores. At the children's service, Sarah Moore headed the whole thing up with the children, as she was very involved with their lives and really loved working with the children. That day, she had the children perform speeches and other fun activities, and everyone had a great time. So after the children were done, they were allowed to play, and the adults hung around and talked and mingled with one another. The event was concluded at around 9:30 p.m. that night, and the Moores and the Stillinger girls walked 3 blocks back to the Moores' home. When they arrived home, Sarah had made milk and cookies for everyone, and that's how they ended their night before going to bed. Sometime between midnight and 1 a.m., the killer had found Josiah's axe leaning up against the house in the backyard. He entered the Moore's home and killed all 8 people inside. Around 7:30 the next morning, Mary Peckham, an elderly neighbor of the Moores, thought it was odd that a house with so many children in it was awfully quiet. They all were usually up at this time and playing or getting ready for work or school, but nothing. Mary decided to call up Josiah's brother Ross, who was a local pharmacist, to let him know what she was observing. Naturally, being concerned for his family, Ross decided to head over to his brother's house and just make sure everything was okay. He arrived sometime before 8:30 a.m. and looked around the house. When he looked in a downstairs window, he could just see inside and saw something no family member wants to see. He saw 2 people covered with a sheet on a bed and blood everywhere. He was able to get a hold of local law enforcement, and a short while later, Marshal Henry Hank Horton arrived and gained entry to the residence. When he came out of the house, he was clearly distraught and told Ross someone was murdered in every bed. He also found the partially cleaned murder weapon resting on the wall near where the Stillinger girls were killed. Later on, investigators said the scene was quite bizarre. The killer had left a 4-pound slab of bacon leaning against the wall next to the axe. The killer also searched dresser drawers for articles of clothing to cover the mirrors in the house. Also on the kitchen table was a plate of uneaten food and a bowl of bloody water. All of the victims were found in their beds with sheets over their heads and had beaten with the blunt end of an axe at least 20 to 30 times each. This was definitely one sick individual. The ceilings in the parents' and children's room had gouge marks in them, possibly made from the upswing of the axe. Lena Stillinger was found with her nightgown pushed up, and she was exposed, and she had defensive marks on her arm. Doctors later stated that they believed she was sexually assaulted, but others have debated this. 2 days later, on June 12th, a funeral was held for the Moores and the Stillinger girls in the town square. Thousands of people were in attendance to pay their respects. National Guardsmen blocked the streets, and the procession was over 50 carriages. This crime was so horrific that it was getting more attention than the sinking of the Titanic that happened just 2 months prior. Now let's talk about some possible suspects and motives that have been thrown around a little bit that seem fairly plausible. And as always, I would like to get your feedback on these as well. The first suspect that everyone pointed their finger at was Frank Jones. The Frank Jones that Josiah had worked for in the past. At this time, everyone was religious in that small town. Josiah was Presbyterian, and Frank was Methodist. So the two sides quickly butted heads, where the Presbyterians said Frank did do it, and the Methodists said he was innocent. But it wasn't differing religions as why Frank was being pointed to as the murderer. As mentioned, Frank owned Jones Stores, which sold farming equipment. Joe was one of his best salesmen, and they had a falling out around 1907 because Joe felt he was being worked too hard. Frank was working him 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. 6 days a week. Joe became so well respected that he decided to go into business for himself and go head-to-head with Frank, and he even took Frank's biggest contract, John Deere, with him. As expected, this did not set right with Frank. There was also some rumors going around that Joe had stepped out on his wife with none other than Frank's own daughter-in-law, Donna Jones, who is known to be a little vivacious. This was never proven, but it was said that these two hated each other so much that when they seen each other in passing, they would walk on opposite sides of the sidewalk to avoid any contact. But at the time of the murders, Frank was 57 and fragile, so people believed he could not have swung an axe by himself, so maybe he enlisted some help. This was the theory of James Wilkerson, an agent of the renowned Burns Detective Agency, who in 1916 announced that Jones had hired a killer by the name of William Mansfield to murder the man who had humiliated him. Wilkerson, who made enough of a nuisance of himself to derail Jones's attempts to secure re-election to the state senate, and who eventually succeeded in having a grand jury convened to consider the evidence he had gathered, was able to show that Mansfield had the right sort of background for the job. In 1914, he was the chief suspect in the axe murders of his wife, her parents, and his own child in Blue Island, Illinois. Unfortunately for Wilkerson, Mansfield turned out to have a cast-iron alibi for the Villisca killings. Payroll records showed that he had been working several hundred miles away in Illinois at the time of the murders, and he was released for lack of evidence. That did not stop many locals, including Ross Moore and Joe Stillinger, the father of the two Stillinger girls, for believing in Jones's guilt. The rancor caused by Wilkerson lingered on in the town for many years. For others, though, there was a far stronger and far stranger candidate for the Axeman. His name was Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly, and he was an English immigrant, a preacher, and a known sexual deviant with well-recorded mental problems. He had been in the town the night of the murders and freely admitted that he had left on a dawn train just before the bodies were discovered. There were things about Kelly that made him seem an implausible suspect. He stood only 5 foot 2 inches and weighed 119 pounds, but in other ways he fit the bill. He was left-handed, and the coroner had determined from an examination of blood spatters in the house that the killer probably swung the axe that way. Kelly was obsessed with sex, and had been caught peering into windows in Villisca 2 days before the murders. In 1914, living in Winter, South Dakota, he would advertise for a girl stenographer and do confidential work, and that ad placed in the Omaha World Herald would also specify that the successful candidate must be willing to pose as a model. When a young woman named Jessamine Hodgson responded, she received in return a letter described by a judge as so obscene, lewd, and filthy as to be offensive to this honorable court and improper to be spread upon the record thereof. Amongst his milder instructions, Kelly told Hodgson that she would be required to type in the nude. Investigation soon made plain that there were links between Lynn Kelly and the Moore family. Most sinister for those who believed in the little preacher's guilt was the fact that Kelly had attended the Children's Day service held at Villisca's Presbyterian Church on the evening of the murders. The service had been organized by Sarah Moore and her children, together with Lena and Ina Stillinger, had played prominent parts dressed up in their Sunday best. Many in Villisca were willing to believe that Kelly had spotted the family in the church and became obsessed with them, and that he had spied on the Moore household as it went to bed that evening. The idea that the killer had lain in wait for the Moores to go to sleep was supported by some evidence. Lindquist's investigation had revealed a depression in some bales of hay stored in the family barn and a knothole through which the murderer could have watched the house while reclining in comfort. That Lena Stillinger had been found wearing no underwear and with her nightdress drawn up past her waist did suggest a sexual motive, but doctors found no evidence of that sort of assault. It took time for the case against Kelly to go anywhere, but in 1917 another grand jury finally assembled to hear the evidence linking him with Lena's murder. At first glance, the case against Kelly seemed compelling. He had sent bloody clothing to the laundry in nearby Macedonia, and an elderly couple recalled meeting the preacher when he left for a 5:19 a.m. train from Villisca that June 10th, and being told that gruesome murders had been committed in the town, a hugely incriminating statement since the preacher had left Villisca 3 hours before the killings were discovered. It also emerged that Kelly had returned to Villisca a week later and shown great interest in the murders, even posing as a Scotland Yard detective to obtain a tour of the Moore house. Arrested in 1917, the Englishman was repeatedly interrogated and eventually signed a confession to the murder, in which he stated, "I killed the children upstairs first and the children downstairs last. I knew God had wanted me to do it this way. Slay utterly came to my mind and I picked up the axe, went into the house and killed them." This he later recanted, and the couple who claimed to have spoken to him on the morning after the murders changed their story. With little left to tie him firmly to the killings, the first grand jury to hear Kelly's case hung 11-1 in favor of refusing to indict him, and a second panel freed him. Perhaps the strongest evidence that both Jones and Kelly were most likely innocent came not from Villisca itself, but from other communities in the Midwest, where in 1911 and 1912 a bizarre chain of axe murders seemed to suggest that a transient serial killer was at work. Research has suggested that as many as 10 incidents that occurred close to railway tracks but in locations as far as Rainier, Washington, and Monmouth, Illinois, might form part of this chain, and in several cases there were striking similarities to the Villisca murder. The pattern, first pointed out in 1913 by Special Agent Matthew McClary of the Justice Department, began with the murder of a family of 6 in Colorado Springs in September 1911, and continued with 2 further incidents in Monmouth and in Ellsworth, Kansas. 3 and 5 people died in those attacks, and 2 more in Paola, Kansas, where someone murdered Roland Hudson and his unfaithful wife just 4 days before the killings in Villisca. As far as McClary was concerned, the slaughter culminated in December 1912 with the brutal murders of Mary Wilson and her daughter Georgia Moore in Columbia, Missouri. His theory was that Henry Lee Moore, Georgia's son and a convict with a history of violence, was responsible for the whole series. It is not necessary to believe that Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the Villisca Moores, was a serial killer to consider that the string of Midwest axe murders have intriguing similarities that may tie the Villisca massacre to other crimes. Moore is now rarely considered a good suspect. He was certainly an unsavory character released from a reformatory in Kansas shortly before the axe murders began, and arrested in Jefferson City, Missouri shortly after they ended, and eventually convicted of the Columbia murders. But his motive in that case was greed, and he planned to obtain the deeds to his family's house, and it is rare for a wandering serial killer to return home and kill his own family. Nonetheless, analysis of the sequence of murders and several others that McClary did not consider yield some striking comparisons. Whether or not all these murders really were connected remains a considerable puzzle. Some pieces of evidence fit patterns while others do not. How, for example, might a stranger to Villisca have so unerringly located Joe and Sarah Moore's bedroom by low light, ignoring the children's rooms until the adults were safely dead? On the other hand, the use of the flat of the axe blade to strike the fatal initial blow does suggest the murderer had previous experience. Any deep cut made with the sharp edge of the blade was more likely to result in the axe becoming lodged in the wound, making it far riskier to attack a sleeping couple. And the Paola murders have striking similarities with Villisca. Aside from the killer's use of a carefully adapted lamp in both cases, for example, odd incidents occurred the same night that suggest the killer may have attempted to strike twice. In Villisca at 2:10 a.m. on the night of the murder, telephone operators heard strange footsteps approaching up the stairs, and an unknown hand tried to unlock their door. While in Paola, a second family was awakened in the dead of night by a sound that turned out to be a lamp chimney falling on the floor. Rising hurriedly, the occupants of the house were in time to see an unknown man escaping through a window. Perhaps the spookiest of all similarities, however, was the strange behavior of the unknown murderer of William Showman and his wife, Pauline, and their 3 children in Ellsworth, Kansas in October 1911. Not only was a chimneyless lamp used to illuminate the murder scene, but a little heap of clothing had been placed over the Showman's telephone. In the Ellsworth case, why bother to muffle a phone that was highly unlikely to ring at 1 in the morning? Perhaps for the same reason that the Villisca murderer took such great pains to cover the faces of his victims, and then went around the murder house carefully draping torn clothing and cloths over all the mirrors and all the windows, because he feared that his dead victims were somehow conscious of his presence. Might the Ellsworth killer have covered the telephone out of the same desperate desire to ensure that nowhere in the murder house was there a pair of eyes still watching him? I would like to know all of your thoughts on this horrific murder, and who do you believe is the true killer in this crime? Fast forward 102 years later, on November 7th, 2014, a visitor to the Villisca Axe murder house was rushed to a nearby hospital after being found with a self-inflicted stab wound to his chest. Robert Stephen Lawrenson Jr. of Rhinelander, Wisconsin, was that visitor. He arrived with a group of friends for a recreational paranormal investigation. He was alone in the northwest bedroom and the rest of the party was outside. He had called for help on their mobile 2-way radios. When his companions found him, he was stabbed in the chest with an apparently self-inflicted stab wound. They called 911, and Lawson was brought to a nearby hospital before being helicoptered to Creighton University Medical Center in Omaha. Perhaps even more disturbing, according to a Montgomery County police report, the incident occurred around 12:45 a.m., which is said to be the approximate time that the 1912 murders of the Moores and the Stillinger girls took place. The now world-renowned Villisca Axe Murder House has been refurbished to its original 1912 appearance. And if you are in the area of Villisca, Iowa, you can book an overnight tour for $428 a night. Many guests of the property claim to have seen potentially malevolent spirits, and they claim that they play with the children, they hear their voices, and they get pictures of anomalies. So due to the overwhelming number of paranormal experiences reported in the house, it has become one of the most regularly visited sites for ghost hunters. Do you believe that dark forces still lie within its cursed walls?